Okay, I'm going to try and remember to stay calm and take it slow today because I'm talking about some material that interests me very much. And so I want to just take my time. I want to talk about the English language novel of the United States in the 19th century. And in particular, today I'm going to talk about Poe, Thoreau, Melville, and Twain. Edgar Allan Poe, Henry David Thoreau, Herman Melville, and Mark Twain, whose real name is Samuel Langhorne Clemens. Mark Twain actually is what a riverboat captain says when you have 2 fathoms or 12 feet, which is enough to float the riverboat. So that's where he got the name Mark Twain. Actually, he stole it from somebody else. But in any event, we're talking about here today Poe, Thoreau, Melville, and Twain. Now, the thing is, before we start in on them, all of these writers, these 19th century United States writers, they're all read today. They're all very well known. But they all actually have also really pretty good reputations. And just about all their works that were very obscure in their own time and little read, are in print today. And they're the subjects of academic studies and all the rest of it, all 4 of them. Nonetheless, I think that the popular image, at least, I'm not accusing scholars of this, I wouldn't know, but the popular image, at least, of all of these writers, I think, has been somewhat whitewashed. There's some elements in what they're saying, some parts of their messages and their books that we haven't concentrated on, whitewashed a bit. And I think that the reason that these 19th century United States novels and their contents and their messages and meanings have been somewhat whitewashed, I'm saying that, using that word, whitewashed, in the popular imagination and their sort of popular cultural role is because, the United States, like any large and powerful nation, no better, no worse, but certainly like any other large and powerful nation, tends to whitewash itself. They say history belongs to the victors, and the first casualty of war is the truth. And I think then that when we see some of the underappreciated and under-remarked elements in all of the writers that we're going to look at today, we also are looking at the same time at some of the things about the United States itself that the United States didn't want to talk about or look at. But, and then just to finish this little introduction here, times are changing. And I think that the United States is in a better position here at the beginning of the 21st century to really confront some of this. It's getting more remote, but also our society is changing and our sort of standards of social authority are changing a little bit. I'm not real mushy on that kind of stuff. So I think it's a time, and I will predict here that our appraisal of these 19th century writers, of Poe, Thoreau, Melville, and Twain, will move back towards a consideration of their social messages. And in particular, I want to stress today the proximity all of this has, of course, to slavery. If you look at where the sort of popular academic crowd is today, it's all about white supremacy and racism and slavery and all the rest of it, which is good, and I'm all for that. So among other things, then for me, looking with those relatively fresh eyes, just from some time going by at this 19th century United States literature, boy, it sure is all about slavery. We all think about the stuff that everybody's thinking about during our times, and each time has its own criticism of other times, its own history for its own purposes. So I do think it's a time for a reappraisal of 19th century United States literature. One more thing I did want to say before I start. I'm talking about 4 white guys, middle-class white guys, Poe, Thoreau, Melville, and Twain. I think if you watch this video, you'll see why I'm doing that and what the message of it all is. I would mention nowadays we have, among other things, I would make 2 points. One is this, that in the 19th century, as far as popular readers, as hard as it is for us to imagine today, when we think of popular readers as people who read mass paperbacks, and we don't think of popular readers as people who read poetry pretty much at all. We don't even think there's really such a thing as popular poetry, I guess. But especially in the first half of the 19th century, but throughout the 19th century, popular readers ordinary people who wanted to read something interesting and have some fun reading something would buy pamphlets and reproductions of poems. The big stars were the poets. And I'm not doing poets today. I'm talking about these prose writers. So for one thing, the real literary stars of the period and the scene that I'm talking about here are poets. People like Longfellow and Englishmen like Wordsworth and people like that. And several of these people, Poe all of his life, Melville for the whole last part of his writing life, were poets and had aspirations to be poets. And I'm not covering poetry at all. So that's one thing I would point out if someone said, hey, you're only doing these four guys who are writing novels. And then the other thing I'd mention, if you ask me as a humanities teacher, North American United States writing, a big issue that you should look at right now, and then I cover another when we're doing other things, are the slave narratives. Of course, we know about Frederick Douglass and the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and we know about Sojourner Truth and Ain't I a Woman, but there have been a very many of these now have been excavated and edited and published, as well as a lot of collateral information. So if you're interested in 19th century United States literature, and again, I'm going to talk about the issue of slavery quite a bit today, but I would say that's really one place where there's a lot of action happening. So I would say, I would mention those things just as mea culpa, because I'm going to talk about these poor white guys. I'm going to talk about Poe, Thoreau, Melville, and Twain. So let me just go to the screen share here. Now, as to that, I say here, writers in the human wilderness, because the sort of stereotypical 20th century trope about 19th century North American writing is sort of the sort of Audubon, John James Audubon kind of lens that it's all about these trackless woods and wildernesses and going through these woods and wildernesses, and of course about the indigenous people. And I don't think that any of the viewers of this video need probably to be informed that, of course, the stories about what was going on with the indigenous people were, for the most part, also really covered up and whitewashed quite a bit. But I say writers in the human wilderness, because this was also, until the end of the war in 1865, a slave society. And it was a frontier society in the sense of lawlessness and in the sense of conflict between different groups of people who really felt that it was their existential right or need to have the land and the territory. Another issue that all of these writers, all of them deal with, I keep saying all of them pose a little, not as political as the rest, but that's okay, is imperialism, and the imperialism that goes with expansion. And we see that for Thoreau, the Mexican-American War was something that upset him very much, radicalized him very much. For Twain, that was the Spanish-American War of 1898. And with the publication of Twain's autobiography recently, we find that actually had a bigger impact. But I want to stress that all of these people have a lot of political literature and nonfiction literature that is underappreciated. So before I go on then now to Edgar Allan Poe, writers then in the human wilderness, a place where anything was possible because it was not under the constraints of any kind of dominant or coercive civilization, in which kind of situation anything can happen and anything did happen. And so revisionism is very important, even though revisionism about North America in the 19th century tends to be a fairly gory story, but I think that's because that's what the story is. Something that you certainly notice looking, for example, at the history of the Spanish conquest as well, which is another interesting. All right, so. Okay. Just take a drink of water here. So, okay. A couple of structural things. Quickly, you had still a we have a video in the series on the Enlightenment novel of the 18th century in England. And there it's very much, it's not clear yet what a novel is. So these boundaries are porous. So you've got this sort of polymorphic form, and it's not always clear what you're reading, and that's also something that's taken advantage of by writers. And in the 19th century, you're still sort of between that. You don't have the novel compartmentalized as a high artistic form the way you do in the 20th century, but you're also not just encountering sort of random pamphlets on the street. You don't know where they came from, like you were, say, in London in the 1700s. Also, the second point, several of these writers are, pretty much hungry artists. They're not recognized, they're not paid, and that's because it was hard to get paid as a writer of prose in North America in the 1800s. These people they remind me almost of French Impressionists and all these. There's several stories, notably for Poe and Melville, of pretty great personal hardship because they just insisted on keeping on writing. It wasn't an easy thing to write. The economy was booming. It was maritime. It was a lot about ships. The United States was a seafaring country. It was a coastal country, and so that's something also that's there. And then that's also something that's structural about the relationship between the wilderness and the people. They're not just standing around in the wilderness. They're extracting as fast as they can. So anyway, the big news here, though, what it's really all about is the last bullet point on this slide. You've got the obvious spiritual and philosophical questions that are raised by a small human standing next to a gigantic mountain and looking at the gigantic mountain, or standing on the coast of the ocean and looking out over the gigantic ocean. I mean, that writes itself. You don't have, so you've got that. But you've got the same kind of existential questions raised, again, notably by slavery and by the general sort of flux of law in North America in that century. So you get a pretty philosophical literature. You get a pretty spiritual literature, one that does go to existential questions about sort of why are human beings here and what can happen to them. There's a lot of dread in this literature. Obviously, human societies are going to whitewash dread out of their literature, but there's a lot of dread in this literature. It's about being on the edge of destruction. That's what being on the edge of the wilderness is. And there's also part of the egalitarianism that comes through. Part of it, of course, is the reaction of these writers and these people to slavery. But part of it also is just this sort of leveling effect that being out in the wilderness, being out on a whaling ship, that being up in a lumber camp near Mount Katahdin in Maine, which is still a remote place to be, brings out in people. Okay, so Poe. Now, again, Poe's a quirky character. I'm not an apologist for any of these people. Edgar Allan Poe was pretty definitely a really bad alcoholic and died from that, almost certainly. Died of a young age, at 40. And in general, he had his episodes and wasn't an easy person, and that's true. It's also, however, true of Edgar Allan Poe that there was another man whose name I shall not mention, who vilified Poe and tried to make Poe out, since Poe is a writer of the macabre, as you probably know, we're going to talk about that, and eerie horror stories and so on. That Poe was some kind of raving madman whose art came from his visions and delusions. And this was part of this sort of mystery that grew up around Poe. But that wasn't Poe's doing. What was Poe's doing was he was very erratic, trouble with alcohol and drugs, and lived a pretty rough life, died when he was 40. So you don't find some of the moral application, let's say, that we find in the other writers that we're going to look at today. However, because of the things that I just mentioned, Edgar Allan Poe is also, at the moment, although he's in very high esteem, he's all in print, people read Poe and think that Poe is good, if you ask them. But I think his influence, his literary influence in terms of sort of the history of letters is sort of almost forgotten, and that's at the time. I mean, coming into the late 19th century, I think that was what people would know about Poe. If you had asked somebody after the Civil War, after Poe's death, what was notable about Edgar Allan Poe, you had been told that he was a notable editor and critic, that he was very important in shaping United States literature because of his criticism and his work editing literary newspapers and journals for a long time. Remember that sometimes I forget how early the early 19th century is when I'm looking at early 19th century North America. And I always have to compare it to Europe. So again, we're in this period, very early 19th century, coming out of the French Revolution, the Romantic period. So think of what Beethoven's doing in trying to sort of devise a emotional scale by sort of doing the taxonomy of different kinds of chords and chord changes and things, and what they did to the human mood. Because the Romantic composer was interested in feelings and thought that feelings were getting closer to the sublime than rational thought. Well, again, Beethoven living at the same time and part of the same Romantic movement that Edgar Allan Poe very self-consciously also belonged to. And Edgar Allan Poe also wanted to elicit emotional responses from readers. Edgar Allan Poe is not a one-off in his writing of Gothic horror monster stories. Remember, this is also the same time as Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, another Gothic work. And there are many other writers in this vein, because it's sort of part of the Romantic movement. Again, he is one of the few here who we're talking about today whose poetry was greatly admired during his own life. And then that last bullet point, he did love to have a reputation. He was always trying to publicize himself. He wrote hoaxes in the newspapers and then announced the hoaxes afterwards. He went for the smart set. He was interested in cryptography, mostly just letter substitution cryptography. But, it's a funny thing. I just learned, looking at some stuff to make this video actually, but apparently the first head of cryptography for the United States in World War I was actually this big Edgar Allan Poe fan. I didn't make that up. So, so part of the reason that he's influential is because he's always exploring with form. He's very creative. So just wanted to, I put this slide in, just in case people don't get it. I was sort of just assuming that everybody understood who and what Edgar Allan Poe is. Perhaps a younger audience might not be familiar with The Pit and the Pendulum or some of these other stories. You should familiarize yourself if you are not. Gothic, again, a kind of offshoot of the Romantic movement, again, stressing the irrationality, cathartic experience of fear and psychological investigation, very contrary to the rationalism of earlier times. At the same time, and especially in North America in the first part of the 19th century, you have a huge upwelling of spirituality, because in North America in the early 20th century, you can have any kind of church or spirituality that you want. And indeed, they had this huge revival culture that was just really wild. So Poe, Gothic is, it's got all the English writers and the Castle of Otranto and all that stuff. But Poe is right up there, and this is also part of the reason that Poe has such a high reputation in Europe. Poe has a very high reputation in Europe. All of these are very famous stories. And the Cask of Amontillado is about someone bricking someone else up inside a wall, this kind of stuff. It's horror. I mean, it's a taste. I don't actually read horror fiction much myself, but Edgar Allan Poe is the master. I mean, ask Stephen King, he'll tell you. But he invented many other things. In Auguste Dupin, Inspector Dupin, in Paris, solving murders, locked Locked room murders, think of Agatha Christie, country house English cozies, we call them these days. Timetable murder plots, who were the suspects and when were they at what times, so that a reader gets intellectually involved trying to figure out, well, could it have been this person or could have been that person. There is a very large literary industry of this stuff. Maybe there would have been without Edgar Allan Poe, although it is pretty specialized. But Edgar Allan Poe really did kind of invent all that stuff. As I mentioned, he also worked with cryptography and other kinds of new sciences to try and interest his readers. And then Arthur Pym, the narrative, The Voyage of Arthur Pym, is actually one of his larger works, I think. It's a short novel. And he had read some Hollow Earth thing, and they end up going into the Earth. Science fiction, not science fiction again, not looking at what the latest technology is moving towards, but using the imagination to figure out, to sort of invent other worlds entirely. And the last one, although Elements of Composition, I have a copy of it here. I pulled it down from the shelf. It's not a long thing. Not much to it, and that's been, but the French symbolist Baudelaire, Mallarmé, thought it was great stuff. They translated his stories, they translated his poetry, and they were very greatly esteemed, the French symbolist poets at the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century in France. And to this day, sure enough, Edgar Allan Poe is perhaps one of the one or two most esteemed United States writers in France. Of course, not like the field of esteemed United States writers in France. It's exactly overcrowded. All right. So, Thoreau. Thoreau isn't known as a fiction writer. In fact, Thoreau doesn't write fiction, but Thoreau does write very beautiful prose. I think he is one of the better writers of the United States in the 19th century, particularly in his nature writings. There are sort of two sides to Thoreau. I esteem both of them equally. The one side is the nature writer Thoreau, and that is, as I say, where I think he really is a beautiful prose stylist and really sets the template for writers, nature writers like John Muir, all kinds of Western writers that is of Westerns, all kinds of writers are in the United States. And then the other side of Thoreau is the political side, which is intense. And he has many, many hundreds of pages, some of which are very well worth reading, on his very many political and social causes. What I want to talk about today with Thoreau is, we want to compartmentalize ecology, environmentalism, from social issues. The closest that will come sometimes is to talk about maybe environmental justice, where you just point out that poor folks whose land isn't worth as much, don't have as much political power, are going to get the gas refineries and the mines and things near to them. That kind of thing. Common sense, and yes, it's true, but what we don't do is have a kind of full critique, or let me put it this way, I think Thoreau is prophetic, because when we get to social criticism, like feminist criticism in the middle of the 20th century, and this idea that the personal is political and sort of everything's political, because the products that you buy are coming from somewhere, and the things that you're doing are leaving a footprint. There's a downstream from you and an upstream from you. And that sort of totalizing, as I say, the phrase would be the politicization of everything, right? Which I think is an obvious corollary of any kind of serious environmentalism. But I think Thoreau absolutely saw that with the clarity of vision. I think that's sort of what Thoreau is all about. You can't just sit idly by and say that, oh yes, I think we should preserve the wilderness. I like all the nice little animals and that kind of stuff. It's much more personal than that. It's about real personal transformation. And that gets to the kind of sacramental status of nature, and that's why Thoreau is categorized with Ralph Waldo Emerson as a transcendentalist, which I don't think is a very good name. All right. So again, a consummate nature writer. Some of these are kind of overlooked, like The Week on the Concord, Merrimack Rivers, and the Maine Woods. Those are just two of the favorites. There's quite a bit of these. There's notebooks that go on for hundreds of pages. And a lot of it is very beautiful and very evocative. His canonical statement, it's really his manifesto, is Walden. And that is, again, just giving a popular account basically of his most basic environmental ideas. He wasn't really living by himself out in the wilderness or anything. He just had this cabin outside of Boston. But let's talk about the philosophical stuff on that last bullet point on the slide. It's not just about respecting nature. It's not even just about identifying nature with God. Those are called the deists. Thomas Jefferson was one of those. Evangelicals today will tell you that the founding fathers were a bunch of Southern Baptists, but that's just preposterous. But they sort of thought that maybe God was nature, like Spinoza. And Thoreau thinks, like the Stoics and the Taoists, that you sort of need to just get in touch with the flow and the changes of nature, that what it really is to live right is to live in touch with this kind of flow of nature. That's sort of what he is. So he thought that the best developer of moral character was nature, and communing with nature was a good way to develop moral character, which I don't see anything, I don't see how that could possibly not be true. And as I say, the personal is political. What ought to cut through when we think of Thoreau, and someone mentions Thoreau and Thoreau's environmentalism, the personal is political. You know, where's your toilet paper coming from? You know, what's your diet? You know, what's your transportation? That's what Thoreau is. Interestingly, he is challenging the fact-value distinction, a claim of empiricism, one I also don't agree with. And I don't think it's really claimed by empiricism, but anyway, let's not get sidetracked. The perception of beauty is a moral test. It's kind of rough because at some point, if we're talking about some kind of virtue theory, you know, what about people who just don't cut it? I mean, what about people who just have a hard time perceiving beauty? And I think Thoreau despised them. I don't think he was, you know, he wasn't necessarily an egalitarian. He thought that there were matters here of cultivation that were being neglected. I mean, certainly. Wildness, second bullet point, in the spiritual sense of thinking out of the box, not being hidebound by social conventions. All United States writers of the 19th century are suspicious of, at a minimum, and most of them patently hostile towards social conventions. Part of that is because the inherent hypocrisy and cruelty of it all is so much right out on the surface in the 19th century North America that it's just sort of absurd. But also because I think the proximity to the wilderness and to other human worlds as well also opened up perspectives onto other ways of being. So Thoreau sort of wants us to get out to nature and kind of empty our minds of the human constructions, just kind of soak into nature. And this is going to do us good. A purification and humbling oneself before nature. And as I say, then Thoreau, even if just for this, Thoreau would be a very important person in United States literature, because Thoreau really does, in many ways, here set the template for nature writing, ecological, that is to say, prescriptive nature writing, which is a real North American thing that is now global. But let's talk about the other side, and finally with Thoreau, the more political side. What's whitewashed about Thoreau? One thing that's definitely whitewashed about Thoreau is his opposition to slavery. Well, we don't want to whitewash anybody's opposition to slavery. Well, maybe not, but over the last 150 years, there have been plenty of people who did. And a lot of people just soon not talk about something unpleasant. Uh, he has much writing on the Penobscot Indians. Thoreau learned to some, we don't know to what extent he did, but we know that he did learn, at least rudimentary, to speak the language of the Penobscot Indians, and he actually wrote about the language and the grammar of the Penobscot Indians. He was that scholarly about it. And he did take concrete steps to defend the Penobscots and their interests. During the run-up to the Civil War, there were Southern intellectuals who pointed out the cruelty of industrial capitalism. Thoreau actually, at the same time, writing early before the Civil War, makes really exactly the same point as people like Fitzhugh and Calhoun were making down in the Carolinas, which is sort of another really interesting aspect of North American intellectual history that I think is overlooked. The Southern Renaissance. Of course, their views on slavery diametrically opposed to those of Thoreau. Mexican-American War outraged him enough that he was put in jail for not paying his war tax. Emerson went to see him in jail, said, "What are you doing here?" Famously, Thoreau said, "Why aren't you here?" Another remark Thoreau made when he was in jail was that he did not consider himself to be the desperate party to the negotiation. So that was a good line. And that led to his writing Civil Disobedience, a real nice tract to read. Martin Luther King Jr. actually had a copy of Civil Disobedience with him when he wrote the letter from the Selma County Jail. And Gandhi used to also explicitly refer to Thoreau. Of course, Thoreau being an American, that also was probably a good idea on Gandhi's part. But it is a very moving expression of what is it about? Thoreau is all about the responsibility of the individual when the mass, when the collective has become destructive. The collective becomes destructive when it loses touch with nature and becomes mindless. And Thoreau, by the way, very definitely and clearly appreciates the connection between this and capitalist expansion. He was a big champion of John Brown. He used to travel and speak for John Brown. Has a bunch of things that he wrote about John Brown. So all kinds of interesting theory in Thoreau that, again, I think is underread and understudied because over the last 100 years or so, maybe over the 100 years before that, people, I think, didn't want this. They wanted being out at Walden and communing with nature and getting away from it all. But that's not really what Thoreau's about. Thoreau's got a lumberyard in his backyard and a steam engine coming through in the distance. And that's really important. Thoreau's not kicking himself out. Thoreau's saying that the human community has to take itself into nature. The individual can't get away. Melville. Wow. I loved Melville so much. He's one of my favorite writers. I loved him so much before I found myself in a position as an adult, someone with a job, that I was actually supposed to maybe understand what it was Melville was talking about. All I knew was I thought it was really cool. Moby Dick, of course, is what I'm talking about here, although I'm certainly going to talk about a number of Melville's other writings today. But Moby Dick, I'll chime in. Yeah, it is one of the one or two most important novels, United States novels. Because of its excellence? Well, sure, maybe. I'm not sure what excellence in a novel really is. Because of its significance, because of how seamlessly it fits into the United States narrative, what an important part of the United States culture Moby Dick really is. Heavy hand on the button. That's very Melville. What is he? I would say he's an Old Testament prophet who objects to all the mamby-pamby New Testament stuff of these transcendentalists and all these other people who think that everything's just going to be all shiny and great in the new world. I think he wants us to see that the natural wilderness is actually the hand of the wrathful God. He finds it presumptuous for the American to think that, or anyone to think that somehow they might actually sort of come to some kind of peace with God. God isn't the kind of thing that one comes to peace with. God is to be feared and respected. And in particular, a lot of the things that the Europeans bring to the New World, their empiricism and their rationalism, all their ways of trying to control themselves in the world, Melville rejects all of that. An Old Testament prophet warning us of our doom, should we become too blasphemous and too disrespectful, and we're on the primrose path. I think that's how I read Melville. And that's not Ahab, by the way. Melville ain't Ahab. Ahab's another thing. Captain Ahab was obsessed enough to get the white whale. Bullet point number 2 on the slide. An old whaling superstition. The right whales, according to Moby Dick, weren't really worth much compared to the sperm whales, but there was an old superstition that if you hoisted a sperm whale up one side of the boat and a right whale head, the right whale head up the other side of the boat never sank. And he has Ishmael sitting there in the boat with a right whale head on one side and a sperm whale head on the other. He says, oh, look, this one's Lockean and that one's a Kantian. So when on one side you hoist in Locke's head, you go empiricist, you go over in the empiricist direction. We'll hoist in Kant's head. And here he is, he's writing this 40 years after Kant published a critique. You go over that way. And see, just throw them both out. Then you'll just float normally. You got yourself all involved. You got one head and your own, you got another head, this is how you're balancing. Chuck it. That's what the New World is about. Last bullet point. This whole Melville, he's from an old New Amsterdam Dutch family. Melville's from an interesting family. His grandfather was an important American officer in the Revolutionary War. And so he does, as pretty much all these people do, come from a fairly religious upbringing. And but again, he rejects this kind of, this is the promised land given to us by God. We will prove ourselves and earn entry to the promised land through our good works, which will be recognized and respected by God. All of that kind of thinking kind of pisses Melville off, And I think that's really what's most powerful about him and really most interesting about him, something darker, but something also deeper, something to think about rather than these sort of platitudes that make us feel okay. The whitewashing. Melville, it's a story, it's a great whaling story. Whitewash. The whole Enlightenment of the 1700s, the 18th century, and the century before it, the scientific revolution, Roger and Francis Bacon and all that. Human beings are going to dominate nature. Human beings are going to understand nature. Nature is here for human beings. The individual human being is the most important thing. All of our arrangements are to take care of that precious, rational, autonomous human being. Ahab thinks this. Ahab indulges himself in thinking that he has some kind of relationship with Moby Dick. That's what dooms him. What dooms him is his own attitude. The scenario that ends in his death is a scenario that is written by himself. Moby Dick doesn't have anything to do with it. Although Moby Dick surely will smash Ahab and the Pequod to bits and make sure they're all dead. But that's just life. Melville insists that the story of the Americas of the New World is the story of getting back to these elemental truths that absolutely dwarf this Lilliputian civilizational stuff that comes out of Europe. It's just preposterous. And if the New World didn't work, I don't know, maybe outer space. Did you ever see the movie Alien? I don't know. Well, takeaway there, though, again, that the obsessed Ahab is precisely the European who thinks that somehow you're at least the equal of nature. Even the idea you could contend with nature. Melville wrote a great deal. He became pretty famous and successful early on, before his own eccentricities, I think, as a writer and a thinker, kind of overwhelmed him. I don't think Melville was very good at thinking about what the public would like to read. I think he was a little too much up in his head. Sometimes people just thought Melville was crazy when he would publish things that were so obviously not commercial. But the commercial stuff, he did in fact go off to sea for 4 years, and he did in fact jump ship in the South Pacific and then get another ship and come back. And he really did all that stuff when he was young. Taipei and Omu are these kind of South Pacific sort of Gauguinian things, and they're nice, and the language is very nice. It's nice to read it, and it starts trying to talk like that. Redbird and White Jacket are pretty straightfaring, straight up seafaring adventures that he wrote leading up to Moby Dick, the masterpiece. Marty, I'm not going to hide it. I'm a big Melville fan, and I have a copy of Marty. I have a copy of Pierre and the Confidence Man right here with me, believe it or not. Nobody else does. Puerto Rico, probably. It's almost unreadable. But if you can, and it's philosophical discussion. But what he's really doing in Marty is, because in Marty, the characters in the New World, these mysterious islands that travel around island to island, very much like Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels. Different stuff on every island. Same kind of idea, 100 years later. And but it's aimed at Americans. Here's the American around in these islands, and everything's different. So Melville, look how perspicuous he is. Look how philosophical he is. He's asking, is freedom really inherently good? Also, look how, again, Old Testament is. Is freedom for itself, for its own sake, really inherently good? Do you have any reason to think so? Do you actually want it? Do you actually want to cause it to be true that human beings are all literally equal to each other? Like, what does that even mean? What is the vision of that? The difference. I guess he's getting the difference between coexistence and sort of conformity, maybe. And uppermost, I think, sometimes in Melville's mind, do you honestly think that scientific progress and technological progress are going to overcome evil, make human beings good, make the world a place with more good and less evil? Do you have any reason to think that? And why should you doubt it? That's the important question. That's the question to ask. So although I don't urge that everybody try and get through Marty, because it'll probably turn you off to Herman Melville forever. But after all, that's what we're here for. Consider those kinds of questions. He writes Pierre the Ambiguities in The Confidence Man, which is a little more accessible. Very odd. I would mention here, again, to me, this is sort of not necessarily here or there, but I appreciate the other scholars and readers it is. There's a lot of homoerotic stuff here and elsewhere, also in the short stories, and of course on Moby Dick, where they're putting the whale penis over their head and running around on the deck and stuff like that all the time. I mean, if you want. Um, but one thing I see in Pierre, and when I read Pierre when I was a teenager, what the hell is going on? But even then, it's clear enough that part of it is out on the frontier, out on a riverboat where the characters are shady, like in Pierre. Uh, you don't know who people are. You're in America, you know, you're in Missouri, you're in Paraguay, whatever. Someone's on the boat, you don't know who they are. They'll tell you who they are, like the Duke and the Dauphin in Huckleberry Finn. They'll tell you who they are. They can tell you anything because it's America, man. You know, short stories are excellent. I mentioned 3 there. Islas Encantadas about the Galapagos is another good one. Billy Budd, really more of a novella, important work. And then the last thing I'll say about Melville, move on to the last writer here. Melville stopped when he was still had quite a bit, about 20 years left to live, writing prose for publication, devoted himself to poetry, including at least one epic poem that, as far as we know, is one of the longest published poems in the English language. I can't even come up with the name of it right now, which tells you something. But now that Melville's, I think, as I mentioned when in the beginning about all these writers, I think we're coming into a period where we have an opportunity to go back and reconsider. And sure enough, researching this video, I find that now there's a movement there are people anyway working on this epic poem and other works of the poetry of Melville, which is woefully understood. So Melville hardly made any. When Melville died, he was unknown. He had his blaze of glory when he's writing these sailing stories in the 1840s, and that was about it. Otherwise, it was a thankless thing for him, but he wrote a tremendous large amount. But the stuff I said at the beginning of the Melville section here, that Melville's an Old Testament prophet, and that's not just rhetoric or some apocalyptic thing. That's something that gives us something to think about. And so that's why today I think Melville's important to me. I've read Moby Dick 3 times, by the way. And I don't say that to brag. I say that because I find, as an educator, that I encounter people say, "Well, nobody really reads that." I mean, read that. I mean, come on. No, Moby Dick is great to read. Like I said, I read it 3 times. I read it when I was a kid. I was working as a clerk and I had a big old thick copy of it in my desk drawer, and I used to read it in my coffee break. So it was one of the times I read Moby Dick. It's great stuff. All right, so read it. Finally, another great writer. His name is Samuel Langhorne Clemens. Mark Twain means 2 fathoms. 2 fathoms, that's about 12 feet, and that's how much water it takes to float the riverboat. He became a Mississippi pilot, Mississippi riverboat paddle wheel steamer pilot, which was actually a very prestigious sort of job to have. And he knew some of the very most famous Mississippi River pilots, like Melville. Twain was the real thing. He went out there and he did have years of experience. He grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, which is a Mississippi riverboat port town. So he's intimately familiar with the Mississippi. Might as well go to the slides. I'm saying what it says on there. Slavery was legal. What do I mean by legal? There are parts of the United States in the middle of before the Civil War, in the 1830s, 1840s. Slavery is illegal in a lot of the New England states. Slavery is illegal in states. I think in New Hampshire it's illegal in 1795. So illegal. So there's a lot of legislative back and forth in Washington, obviously, but Missouri was a border state, and slavery was legal in Missouri when Samuel Clemens was growing up. Samuel Clemens, I say they're the sound heart. Samuel Clemens says, you have a sound heart, that's about empathy. And all of his humor is making gentle fun, even in the roughest, most violent things that he talks about, of human nature. general human nature, universal human nature, is funny because it's so predictable, and we observe it ruefully. It's black humor, but he's very funny. Um, he's a humor writer. But again, you think, Poe writes horror stories. Melville writes seafaring stories. Thoreau writes is a nature writer. Mark Twain is a humorist. None of that captures the intensity and the seriousness of purpose of any of these writers, or the intensity of their material. Um, for Twain, uh, slavery is just an extreme. Slavery is just the logical extension of what happens when you don't respect other people as much as you respect yourself, and notably when, instead of using your own sound heart, you start to run around with the mob, with the mass, and let popular opinion define who and what people are. That's really the problem. Twain wants to take away this mask. He's the most humble born of any of the four writers that we talk about today. His father was not successful. They were middle class people, but he always wrote to make money. He didn't, and he grew up in very far from sort of enlightened surroundings. He has a humorous story about when he was briefly involved in a Confederate militia before everything fell apart. He ran off, and then he and his brother went out west, like a lot of people did after the Civil War, to sort of get away from all that. But his experience and all of that, I think he really came to be he's anti-imperialist. He gives a speech, at least one speech, in favor of giving women's suffrage in 1901. That's about 19 years before women got the vote. He's against vivisection, needless cruelty towards animals. He's the vice president of the Anti-Imperialist League for many years. And he is then, and of course he's writing at a time after slavery. Notice that Twain is later, his life falls a bit later than the first three. But I think Twain, the humorist, is the one, and Twain who gets, and I do want to speak to this, Twain who gets criticized even for being racist, in a way is, I think, the most radical progressive, the most radical political person of all these people. I think you can make more than Thoreau. I think you can make an argument. Well, maybe not more than Thoreau, not in his life. All Twain ever wanted to do was make money, and he lost it all. Let's talk about The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which is the masterpiece. It's the masterpiece. If you like it, there's lots more where it came from. It's one of the first major novels written in a vernacular dialect. He switches around between the educated people and the poor people, between the whites and the blacks. So starting in on one thing I want to talk about here, people at the time didn't like Huckleberry Finn because they didn't really approve of people using the vernacular dialect. And they didn't really approve of these kind of realistic depictions of the conditions out in these towns. So later on, when people started criticizing Mark Twain for various mistaken reasons, thinking that he's a racist writer, that just got kind of piled on to this mutually contradictory earlier critique that he was, uncomfortable going places he shouldn't go. He always sets up contrasts between individuals to show injustice. But it's very simple. He does it in book after book, and he does it in Huck Finn a bunch. Huck has an abusive alcoholic father. His father is this feral man named Pappy, who lives out in a shack in the woods. And he just wants to use Huck to get more money, to get more alcohol. He doesn't care about Huck. And at one point, he actually starts keeping Huck, captive, because he doesn't want Huck to run away. So he's holding Huck captive and beating him his shed. Jim, meanwhile, the slave, who belongs to these people who know Tom Sawyer and thereby acquaintance of Finn, he is under threat of being sold down the river to almost certain death to some horrible. He gets sold down the river down south, just to go down to the cotton plantations and the sugar plantations, maybe even out to the sugar and salt plantations in the islands, from which you were not going to return. I mean, it was done as punishment. I mean, if you sold someone down the river, they'd never be seen again. And so Jim understood that the not nice sister of Aunt Polly is fixing to do that. Well, so they both run away. They encounter each other running away, and they decide to team up. But people sympathize with Huck. Nobody's going to go run and try and find Huck if you ran away from Pappy Finn. Jim, meanwhile, they organize search parties to go look for him. If people find out that Huck's a runaway, they help him. If they find out that Jim's a runaway slave, they call police. There isn't any difference. Huck himself has been taught that crimes against property is stealing, and helping a slave escape is stealing, and that's and you'll go to hell. So there's a real pivotal epiphanic moment in the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn when he resolves to go rescue Jim from these people who have him. They go through a lot of adventures in the book, and he says, well, he knows in his heart, because he's been taught by the church and his family, it's wrong to go help steal the slave. But he says, well, okay, I'll go to hell then. And that's this contrast that is so important to Twain between the sound heart of an individual person who's centered and sees that all other people are the same, versus someone who's being swept away with the social construction about these people are that way and those people are that way. I think that's Twain's main sociological message. Some people don't like the final section of Huckleberry Finn because Tom Sawyer shows up and gets involved in this crazy thing, boys club stuff, where he wants them to pretend to be pirates and use secret codes and stuff. All they need to do is get Jim out. Well, it seems all very gratuitous, since if any of it screws up, Jim is lost. But that's the point. The point is these boys' games, right? These boys' adventure games that Tom is getting out of these boys' books that he reads are determining the fate of Jim. That's the whole point, and that's why it's important. And that is this example of sort of sanitizing the violence out of this. I mean, Twain wants you to see that. And let me step out of here to say something, because it does come up, and I guess this is the time I'm going to talk about Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn. I have to talk about it. And that is that Mark Twain has been accused of being a racist writer because he uses the N-word. And I want to say a couple things about that. And it's too bad, but sometimes, you just have to say things because you really believe in them, even if you'd rather not say them because you'd rather not get any flack from anybody. Well, this is one of those times. First of all, basics. Twain is an anti-slavery writer. He's an explicitly anti-slavery writer. It's not incidental. It's the document that you're looking at is to a large extent an anti-slavery document. That's its purpose. And it is depicted, written 40, 50 years after the time it's set. Not to say that people didn't use the N-word when Mark Twain lived in the 1870s and 80s, because they most certainly did. They most certainly did. And there are even darker times yet to come, even. You don't want people to read the book. First of all, I don't use the N-word. I don't even use it in my mind. I really don't. I mean, for what it's worth, I don't think, I wasn't raised that way. Um, but there's a distinction between using a word and mentioning a word. Okay, you can mention a word. For example, the word that we're talking about right now is the word nigger. Okay, and when I say it that way, I'm mentioning it. I'm saying that's the word that we're talking about. That's the use mention distinction. It's not an excuse to use a word to be bad to someone else. And that brings me to this point. People say, people at Columbia were saying, some student panel were saying that they didn't want Ovid's Metamorphoses to be taught in the classics because it had too much depiction of, like Zeus coming down as a swan and raping Leda, and it's got like 250 of these things in it. Look, nobody has to agree with me. I'm nobody. I don't take myself that important. But as an educator, I'll tell you what. I want the students to be upset, trouble, not because I'm a sadist, not because I want to hurt some poor quivering Briton. That's preposterous. I need to help cultivate strong, right, self-determined people, and those people need to be able to face reality. It's not because I'm in the grip of some macho ideology that we all have to be tough. No, it's really, really important that somebody be strong enough to look at the bad stuff and think about it and deal with it. Okay. So anyway, I don't know. There's more to say. I'm not sure. I didn't figure out some big thing to say. I just want to stand up for it. You're very off base if you think that Huckleberry Finn is a racist book or that Mark Twain is a racist man. Another point, as to that is that, well, maybe Mark Twain, maybe he is kind of racist. He's this guy who grew up in Missouri in the 19th century, and that's another thing. I mean, what's he supposed to be? I was getting ready for this video, and I read somewhere somebody saying, well, Twain did not rise up above the blah, blah, blah. Well, is that what he's supposed to do? He's an artist. So that's another approach, right? So I'm just saying that I think a lot of that kind of criticism in the case of Mark Twain is really inane. If someone tells me that Dostoevsky is an anti-Semite and a fascist, and I sort of see what they mean. I'm still really gonna, I still really get a lot out of Dostoevsky, but I don't necessarily think he thinks the way that I think. But I don't have any problem like that with Mark Twain. Mark Twain, let's get back to the slides. I want to show you some more stuff about Mark Twain now. And consider this if you're someone who's sort of helping yourself to saying that, you think Mark Twain is somehow politically a bad person. People do this about John Lennon, stuff. What the hell they're talking. I talked about the way that Twain juxtaposes people. Switch these two people, and how do you feel about the fact that now how do you feel about the situation? Now you've switched the two people. Here's a lady and her maid. Let's make the lady the maid and the maid the lady. Now then, how do you feel about that? Does that just look just normal to you? In The Prince and the Pauper, set back in the time of King Henry VIII, he has a number of books where what he does is go back in time, and then he'll use that as another framing device to show some hypocrisy and inanities of various conventions. Really does that in The Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court as well, which is a very good book. So in The Prince and the Pauper, the rightful king of England, King Henry VIII's actual son, and a poor boy, they're identical looking teens. They trade places until finally in the end, the real king is able to prove that's who he is, which is okay. They're not mad at each other. But the frame is just used to show injustice. It's just a way of showing, well, this guy, it's like this, and for this guy, it's like that. He does it again over 10 years later in Pudd'nhead Wilson. And when I was in high school, my mother said, here, it's time, you're old enough now, you need to read Pudd'nhead Wilson. My mother wanted everyone in the family to read Pudd'nhead Wilson, because Pudd'nhead Wilson is, again, a full-blown anti-slavery, anti-racist book. The light-skinnedness is maybe problematic. I don't know if being 32% black, I don't know. But what is the book? The same deal. You got a very light skinned, his mother is, I guess, what would it be, 1/16 black. She has a resentment against his wealthy family. The babies look a lot the same. They're the same color, basically. And so she switches the babies. And the one baby grows up to be spoiled and cruel, which I interpret as showing context, environment. And the other one is treated cruelly. He internalizes it. He internalizes his status as a slave. He doesn't do that badly. In the end, they are restored. It's discovered and it's reversed. And the most unspeakable thing happens to this person who thought he was white all his life and a privileged, rich white boy. That is to say, he gets sold down the river by his owners because not for anything he did. They're just liquidating their estate because they owe money. So that's the last we see. He's gone. But the guy, the quote black unquote guy, he doesn't, who then now is suddenly restored to status of prosperous white person. He also doesn't do well. He's not. He never feels at home. He doesn't. He's then ever detached. So again, identical people. They look the same. Think of Thomas Jefferson and his cousin who looked like him, who was a slave. Right? And some people apparently people got them mixed up on the street. So again, this contrast is showing the hypocrisy and naturalness of it, preposterousness of it, and above all, the fact that it is social construction. It is the social construction of reality that is defining these people in the most capricious and unimaginably cruel way. Okay, so that's the end of that. So again, just to sum up, I'm sure we went on long enough, but look, a couple of things going on in here. One is I think this literature has been very much whitewashed. All of these writers are much more perspicuous social and political critics than they've been traditionally seen to be. And that is because of the issue of, mostly I think because of the issue of racism and slavery here. And then I would go on and say that I think here at the beginning of the 21st century in year 2021, looks to me like we're in a situation where we're in a position where we might be able to do some reappraisal here and excavate these people anew. I think we're coming into a position where we might be able to appreciate them anew because we are willing, I think, I hope, now a little more to really try and go back and look at some of these issues, think about white supremacism, think about the legacy of slavery. It's funny that it all turned into a political video, but I hope also that the value of this writing comes through. It's very, hopefully the remarks I made today sort of add to the richness of it, because I think all the other good things are still there. And, none of this takes away from any of that. So, well, anyway, I guess I better stop talking. Sometimes you just know.